San Juan, Puerto Rico, as Hurricane Maria unleashed its fury on Puerto Rico in mid-September, knocking out the island's electrical system and damaging hundreds of thousands of homes. Disaster recovery experts expected that only one man could handle the enormity of the task ahead, Byrne. But Byrne, a widely acknowledged star of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, remained in Houston, which had been ravaged by Hurricane Harvey less than a month earlier. Today, disaster recovery experts still express shock that FEMA kept Byrne in an already stabilizing Texas and didn't send him to Puerto Rico for 3 more weeks. But now, the decision strikes many as emblematic of a double standard within the Trump administration. A Politico review of public documents, newly obtained FEMA records and interviews with more than 50 people involved with disaster response indicates that the Trump administration and the president himself responded far more aggressively to Texas than to Puerto Rico. We have the U.S. Army and Marine Corps.We go anywhere, anytime we want in the world, bemoaned retired Army Lt. Gen.Russel Honoré, who led the military's relief efforts after Hurricane Katrina. And in Puerto Rico we didn't use those assets the way they should have been used. No two hurricanes are alike, and Harvey and Maria were vastly different storms that struck areas with vastly different financial, geographic, and political situations. But a comparison of government statistics relating to the two recovery efforts strongly supports the views of disaster recovery experts that FEMA and the Trump administration exerted a faster and initially greater effort in Texas, even though the damage in Puerto Rico exceeded that in Houston. Within 6 days of Hurricane Harvey, U.S.Northern Command had deployed 73 helicopters over Houston, which are critical for saving victims and delivering emergency supplies. It took at least 3 weeks after Maria before it had more than 70 helicopters flying above Puerto Rico. "9 days after the respective hurricanes, FEMA had approved $141.8 million in individual assistance to Harvey victims versus just $6. $2 million for Maria victims. During the first 9 days after Harvey, FEMA provided $5. $1 million meals, 4.5 million liters of water, and over 20,000 tarps to Houston, but in the same period, it delivered just $1. $6 million meals, 2.8 million liters of water, and roughly 5,000 tarps to Puerto Rico. "9 days after Harvey, the federal government had 30,000 personnel in the Houston region, compared with 10,000 at the same point after Maria. It took just 10 days for FEMA to approve permanent disaster work for Texas, compared with 43 days for Puerto Rico. "78 days after each hurricane, FEMA had approved 39% of federal applications for relief from victims of Harvey versus 28% for Maria. Those imbalances tracked with another one, the attention of President Donald Trump. In public, Trump appeared much more concerned with the victims of Harvey than Maria. He visited Houston twice during the first 8 days after the hurricane, but didn't visit Puerto Rico for 13 days. In the first week after the disasters, Trump sent 3 times as many tweets about Harvey as Maria, 24 about the plight of Texas and 8 about Puerto Rico, including a series of comments about Puerto Rico's debt level and quality of infrastructure that local officials considered insulting and enraging, while lives were still in jeopardy. Wow. Now experts are calling Number Harvey a once-in-500-year flood. We have an all-out effort going, and going well, he crowed about Texas on August. "27, 2 days after the storm made landfall. On Sept.30, 10 days after Maria, and while fielding criticism from Puerto Rican officials, Trump testily tweeted, "They want everything to be done for them, and it should be a community effort." "10,000 federal workers now on island, doing a fantastic job." Behind the scenes, according to people with direct knowledge of his comments, Trump was focused less on the details of the relief effort than on public appearances, repeatedly using conference calls and meetings designed to update him on the relief effort to direct FEMA Administrator Brock Long to spend more time on television touting his agency's progress. In addition, Trump spent the first weekend after the Puerto Rico crisis tweeting repeatedly about NFL players kneeling for the national anthem. Those messages, experts said, send a subtle, yet important signal to the federal bureaucracy. On Texas and Florida during Hurricane Irma, the president was very vocal and engaged in the run-up to the storm. His messaging was frankly pretty good, said Jeremy Konindick, the former top disaster response official at USAID under former President Barack Obama. If you look at his public messaging on a comparable timeline around Puerto Rico, there's virtually nothing. That sends a signal to the whole federal bureaucracy about how they should prioritize. FEMA and administration officials defend the response to the storm, saying it posed unprecedented logistical challenges as the agency faced perhaps the most demanding stretch in its 39-year history. Hurricane Maria was the third major hurricane to strike the United States in less than a month. Combine that with an overwhelmed local government and non-existent communications, and it created a fog of war atmosphere that made it difficult to determine what resources were needed when and how to get them to an island whose ports and airports were heavily damaged. In a statement to Politico, Long defended FEMA's efforts, arguing that, unlike in Texas, the agency was forced to take on a greater role in the post-disaster response. "We provided Puerto Rico the same, if not more support, as we have for all presidentially declared disasters across the nation," he said, "but an optimal response cannot rely on FEMA's efforts alone." A spokesperson for the National Security Council said Trump was personally engaged on the response, and his primary directive to Long was to oversee a unified and effective federal response. But in that situation, former FEMA officials say, extra political pressure and impetus can make a difference. Puerto Rico, as of U.S. territory, rather than a state, has just a single, non-voting delegate in Congress, compared with the 36 representatives and 2 senators from Texas who loudly demanded proper resources for their state. Likewise, victims of Superstorm Sandy had 6 senators and dozens of U.S. representatives in the states of New York, New Jersey and Connecticut to demand extra disaster relief, including powerful lawmakers like Chuck Schumer, then the No. Three Democrat in the Senate. After Sandy, Rep. Peter King was all over FEMA continuously. So was Schumer, said Michael Balboni, a former New York State legislator and an expert on disaster response. That constant pressure on senior federal officials, he added, is critical to getting the proper resources after a disaster. In that vacuum, presidential leadership plays a larger role. But as the administration moves to rebuild Texas and Puerto Rico, the contrast in the Trump administration's responses to Harvey and Maria is taking on new dimensions. The federal government has already begun funding projects to help make permanent repairs to Texas infrastructure. But in Puerto Rico, that funding has yet to start, as local officials continue to negotiate the details of an experimental funding system that the island agreed to adopt after a long, contentious discussion with Trump's Office of Management and Budget. Multiple congressional staffers and people with direct knowledge of the arrangement said White House officials told Puerto Rico's governor, Ricardo Rossello, that if he didn't agree to the experimental formula, the island wouldn't get the money, effectively forcing the island to take a huge gamble since it would be responsible for any cost overruns, a requirement that doesn't exist for Texas. The White House denies making that demand. There is no doubt that Puerto Rico gets treated differently to a state. And there is no doubt that it has been true for the disaster response as well, Rossello said in an interview at the governor's mansion in Old San Juan. He added, "Our objective is to eradicate this notion of second-class citizenship in the United States so that whenever a disaster hits, whether it's Texas, Florida, New York or Puerto Rico, the federal government responds equally in all cases." After Hurricane Harvey hit the Houston region on Aug. 25, dropping over 50 inches of rain and flooding whole swaths of the metropolitan region, FEMA quickly mobilized, sending out mission assignments to a long list of federal agencies. In less than a week, U.S.Northern Command deployed 73 helicopters, and the Coast Guard sent an additional 18. Within 9 days, a whopping 30,000 federal personnel were helping an army of state and local authorities with the response, conducting search and rescue missions, removing debris and helping victims apply for disaster assistance, among many other assignments.